eventually, even the doziest shareholders began to wake up to the fact that some of the self-remunerators were in fact looting the company. And then came the demands, all through the 90s, that special remuneration committees be set up to monitor these rewards of top executives. See, they didn't get out of hand. And there were a series of official reports of extremely well-meaning nature on the governance of corporations. Cadbury in 1992, Greenbury in 1995, Campbell in 1998. And these remuneration committees were intended to be impartial bodies, composed of non-executive directors who had no personal interest in the outcome. Some hope. For the non-execs were to be nominated by the existing executive directors, who, not surprisingly, chose people very much like themselves. An executive director of one firm might well sit alongside one of his non-execs on the board of another firm where their roles were reversed. The members of this mutual admiration society could scarcely be expected to take an austere view of their colleagues' personal needs, and in most cases they did not. In fact, rather than acting as a restraint on these huge jumps in the pay of senior executives, the remuneration committees, they actually have helped to legitimize them, because people say, well, the remuneration committee thought I was worth £2.5 million, so who are you to disagree? Nor did the remuneration committees purse their lips at the size of the fringe benefits expected by CEOs to sweeten their labours. Pension pots worth millions of pounds became routine. So did clauses stipulating vast payoffs for loss of office if the CEO were to depart before his allotted time. This was in theory to compensate for the crippling insecurity of the CEO's position in the harsh, competitive new business world. But of course, the generous basic salary and the bonuses already compensated in a most handsome way for any shortness of tenure. These basic rewards were encrusted as richly as Damien Hirst's skull with glittering perks, many of which could scarcely be described as intrinsically necessary for the workings of the business. Memberships of golf and health clubs, debentures to Wimbledon, boxes at Ascot or the Arsenal, school fees, rent-free country houses, and so on. When HSBC bought the ill-fated firm of Household, it paid an additional £35 million for the services of Household's chief executive, Bill Aldinger, plus various benefits, of which the cream was lifelong free dental work for Bill and his wife, Alberta. This was regarded by some as a bridge work too far. It was certainly not a unique demand. And we don't actually have to presume that Bill and Alberta actually insisted on free dentistry, so we're not coming unless we get. Increasingly, these frills are dreamt up by third parties, lawyers drawing up the contract, or headhunters who find the new recruit. The vast sums paid to these headhunters typically include a substantial percentage of the successful candidate's salary for the first few years of the job, which of course is a further incentive to make sure that the salary is as high as possible. Now, the interesting thing is that all this has happened relatively recently. In retrospect, what is remarkable is how long it took for the managers to realize that they had the whip hand and could, with impunity, grab a huge slice of the action. For many decades, the appetites of the managers in both the public and the private sectors were constrained by stern institutional and political inhibitions. In a fascinating recent article in the New Yorker, Malcolm Gladwell points out that between about 1930 and 1960, the rewards enjoyed by top managers in the US in the period of its great industrial dynamism actually fell. In 1935, American lawyers made on average 4 times the average per capita income in the country, which is a fairly modest multiple. J.P. Morgan, the great New York banker, said that no boss should earn more than 20 times what his employees earn. I'm not sure he kept that, but that was his idea. But by 1958, American lawyers were only making 2.4 times the average wage, so their position had declined. The president of DuPont, Crawford Greenwald, told Congress in 1958 that he was taking home half what his predecessor had taken home 30 years earlier. Star pro baseball players, like star football players in the UK, were paid peanuts. And then, from the 60s onwards, player power in both business and sport took off like a rocket. Today, over half the income of a successful merchant bank such as Goldman Sachs, or a successful football team such as Chelsea, may be consumed by the players' wages. The gap between the top earners and the bottom has yawned to abysmal proportions. The average CEO being paid in millions, where even the average annual wage barely scrapes past £20,000 a year. Sir Terry Leahy of Tesco is paid 900 times as much as the average Tesco employee. Sir Martin Sorrell of WPP receives 630 times the wage of his average staff member. As Gladwell puts it, capital has crumbled in the face of a determined collective assault by talent, even when talent is producing mediocre or even dismal results. And it's interesting that in the same way, in the public sector too, the rewards earned by management in the early post-war decades were kept in check largely by those underrated defenders of the public interest, ministers of the Crown. Ministers directly controlled the pay of the member of the chiefs of the coal board or the railways and dozens of other public or publicly owned bodies. And while the salary scales of doctors and dentists, headmasters, state schools and senior civil servants and university vice-chancellors might be recommended by outside bodies, it was ministers who had the final say in these matters too. And more importantly, they would have to defend their decision to MPs and to the media. And if you look back at the political diaries and memoirs of this period, you'll be struck by how much time and effort ministers had to put in to dispose of these ticklish matters in a way that didn't affront public opinion. One of the first consequences of privatization, which had many merits, was to relieve ministers of these thankless tasks and set managers free to determine their own pay. And I think we can all remember at the moment when we suddenly saw these rather unremarkable managers of public utilities transformed overnight into superstars who needed to be paid 3 times as much as before. The locus classicus, you'll recall, was the case of Cedric Brown of British Gas. There was something about the name Cedric which suggested irredeemable flaw. For all I know, he may have been an extremely efficient, but this was the sort of symbol of the sudden elevation to the stratosphere of these new gods. The whimpers of Sid and other shareholders and stakeholders could be safely disregarded. With one bound, the manager was free at last to fulfill the delicious destiny mapped out by Burl and Means half a century earlier. These days, even the heads of charities, such as housing associations, may be paid several £100,000 a year, to say nothing of university vice-chancellor, but I think I'd better.